The world had always seemed to move with the randomness of a falling leaf. A beautiful chaos, perhaps, but ultimately unpredictable. Until then. Until that single moment when an unnatural discord pierced the quiet hum of existence. It was not loud, nor sharp, merely perfect in its wrongness. A deep tremor resonated through his understanding, suggesting that everything he had taken for granted, the steady rhythm of heartbeats, the reliable arc of a thrown stone, the change of seasons, was merely an imitation. There was a fundamental law-governing reality that lay beneath the surface of appearance, a truth hidden by mere perception. Pythagoras felt drawn into this unsettling questioning. He began to listen with a new ear, not for the sounds of man or animal, but for the pure structures underlying all things. And what he heard was a harmony too perfect to be accidental. It echoed in the silent spaces between thoughts, weaving through the texture of the air itself. This dissonance became his obsession, shifting from an academic curiosity into a profound spiritual calling. He understood that this echo spoke not merely of pleasing sound, but of absolute mathematical necessity. If music could reveal such deep structures, what of existence itself? What geometry governed joy or sorrow? What arithmetic defined the passage of time? He found himself observing the world as if it were a massive equation waiting to be solved. He watched sunlight shifting across dust motes, recognizing not just light, but ratios. The way one angle related precisely to another, creating an inevitable balance. The relationship between the length of a pillar and the curve of an adjacent wall struck him with the force of revelation. It was never haphazard. It always obeyed certain rules. The immediate world felt less solid, more like an elaborate, vibrating membrane stretched over unseen lines of force. If a single string snapped, or a ratio became even slightly skewed, the entire structure threatened to unravel into noise and meaninglessness. This deep discomfort led him away from the casual rhythms of life, urging him toward meticulous study and isolation. He sought out patterns in what others dismissed as mere accident: the spiral of a seashell, the branching pattern of roots seeking water, the way falling rain struck the earth in seemingly disconnected drops that yet formed collective rhythmic patterns. He began to quantify his internal experience. Was grief proportional to loss? Was joy directly related to simple pleasures? He treated his own emotional landscape like an unknown sequence, believing that if he could chart its progression using number and measure, he would find a corresponding law of nature governing the human spirit. The pursuit became both exhilarating and terrifying. To believe that such universal order existed meant accepting an absolute structure that dictated everything, even free will itself. The freedom to merely stumble or wander seemed suddenly diminished, replaced by the elegant, constraining geometry of necessary truths. He wrestled with the unsettling idea that perhaps every moment was determined not by choice, but by a preceding arithmetic calculation. He walked through fields and cities, now seeing only ratios. A doorway was not just an entrance, it was a measured proportion against the wall beside it. The arrangement of market stalls was not simply commerce. It was a calculated spacing designed for maximum flow and minimal wasted space. Everything spoke in measures of length, time intervals, and measurable relationships. But this overwhelming sense of structure soon brought him to an impasse. If reality were governed by pure number, then perhaps the most profound human experiences, the unexpected kindness, the wild burst of irrational passion, the sheer beauty of a mistake, could not exist. They seemed to violate the serene certainty of mathematical perfection. He felt the pull between the sublime elegance of calculation and the messy, glorious imperfection of life lived day to day. The harmony he heard was crystalline, beautiful, and utterly cold. It demanded adherence, a surrender to the predictable beat of universal law. Yet, man himself is often fueled by the illogical whim, the surge of emotion that defies neat categorization. Pythagoras stood at the crossroads of these two realities, the immutable purity of number and the unpredictable depth of being. The perfect chord had sounded its warning, revealing a deep mathematical order in creation, but it had also cast a challenging shadow over the messy, beautiful heart of what it meant to be truly human. He was left with the weight of this great discovery, the knowledge that beneath all chaos lay calculation, and that understanding might require him to sacrifice much of his lived experience at the altar of truth. The echoes of the perfect chord still rang in his mind, a persistent vibration that refused to fade. It was a calling, a mathematical certainty that contradicted the chaotic mess of existence he had known before. He looked at the stones scattered across the dusty earth, and instead of seeing simple objects, he saw potential ratios, invisible equations waiting to be revealed. This newfound clarity, this divine imposition of pattern, did not bring immediate peace. It brought a profound and challenging doubt. He began his experiments in silence. His days became rituals of measurement. He would count the shadows cast by the midday sun, meticulously grouping them into sets of 3 or 5. He watched the grain patterns on an old wooden beam, seeing repeating sequences that seemed to govern its very structure. Everything demanded quantification. Every fluttering leaf drop was a data point. Every casual conversation, a complex equation awaiting simplification. Yet, this relentless focus created a new kind of paralysis. The world did not behave like a neat mathematical proof written on parchment. Sometimes, the shadows defied prediction, stretching in ways that seemed arbitrary, governed by whim rather than simple geometry. He counted the scattered flocks of birds overhead, anticipating geometric formations, but they would shift suddenly, defying his ratios with sudden, chaotic bursts of movement. Where he sought elegant progression, he found sudden breaks, moments of irreducible randomness. The pattern recognition was intoxicating, a brilliant addiction. By finding a grouping of 7 stones or realizing the golden ratio in the spiral of a snail shell, he felt momentarily whole, as if he had solved the fundamental riddle of being. But this euphoria was fragile. The truth that seemed so clean and absolute, that reality followed mathematical law, kept colliding with life's undeniable messiness. One afternoon, observing the stream, his initial certainty faltered. He grouped the skipping stones into sequences, noting how their hops followed predictable diminishing arcs. This confirmed a lovely physical rhythm. But then, a single pebble, lodged oddly in the mud by an unseen current, remained at the edge of the perfect progression. It disrupted the pattern entirely. Why was it there? What ratio governed its placement? Its placement seemed determined by nothing but chance, mocking his careful measurements. He started keeping detailed records, marking down every observation, the number of breaths taken in a minute, the ratio of daylight hours to shadow length. These ledgers became more crucial than any philosophy book. They were proof. Proof that beneath the apparent fluidity of life lay an unshakable, elegant scaffolding of numbers. But doubt was not simply the absence of belief. It was the active confrontation with inconsistency. The mathematical model he sought to construct seemed sturdy enough to hold up the weight of the cosmos, yet it crumbled slightly when faced with the unpredictable contours of human emotion. His own life provided the most confounding variables. A simple act of kindness from a passerby held no measurable ratio. Laughter felt too buoyant, too uncontrolled by algebraic law. And worry, that cold knot in his stomach, seemed to defy neat classification. Was fear predictable? Could grief be reduced to a sequence of diminishing return? He ran through these questions like feverish arithmetic calculations. The dilemma grew heavier, pressing down on him. The perfection he loved was beautiful and logical, yet it felt hollow when applied to the depths of human experience. If life was merely numbers playing out equations, then where did free will reside? Was man simply a calculation of chemical reactions and predictable biological impulses? Or was there an element, a chaotic variable that refused to be quantified, the unpredictable spark, that made life truly worth living? He walked away from his counting, retreating into contemplation. He found himself staring at the horizon, no longer seeing merely distant objects governed by perspective ratios. He saw the limits of his own knowledge. The numbers were a breathtaking map of possibility, yet they could not explain the destination itself. This realization was both liberating and terrifying. It meant that certainty was an illusion, and truth lay perhaps in accepting the beautiful, vital inconsistency, the irreducible randomness, that resisted every neat formula. His quest had moved from finding proof to confronting the limits of definition. The shadow of doubt now seemed less like a failing of his logic, and more like the necessary precondition for deeper understanding. His obsessive counting of ratios had taken him to the edge of certainty. He believed that if he could only measure enough things, the shadows, the arrangements of stones, even the span between two moments, he could map the entire architecture of reality. But every answer seemed incomplete, a fragile equation missing its final variable. Certainty itself felt like an echo chamber, promising perfect order but delivering only brittle glass. The frustration was a deep ache in his bones. He yearned for a system that did not break when confronted by the sheer unpredictability of human existence, the sudden flare of joy, the unexpected sting of sorrow. Math offered exquisite logic, yes, but it felt cold, sterile, an empty blueprint lacking life's vital breath. It was this state of intellectual desperation that led him to a quiet corner of the city, away from the clamor of market chatter and the chaotic murmur of human endeavor. There, he found a master craftsman, a figure seemingly woven from the dust of history. This man did not lecture with grand theories. Instead, he worked silently, his hands moving with an almost impossible precision around blocks of wood and geometric shapes. He was intensely focused on building something that was both beautiful and mathematically perfect. Pythagoras watched him, drawn in by the very aura of flawless order surrounding the master's station. The craftsman was not merely skilled, he seemed to embody principle itself. Every cut, every joint, every curve followed an inherent rule of balance, a geometric truth that could neither be argued with nor defied. It spoke of permanence. The old master did not acknowledge Pythagoras' presence directly at first. He continued his work, fitting together angles and lengths until the resulting form achieved a harmonious state. For hours, there was only the quiet scrape of wood against wood, punctuated by the rhythmic tap of mallet on chisel, sounds that themselves held an impeccable cadence. Pythagoras began to observe not just the shapes, but the process of their creation. He noted how the master never seemed to force a piece. Rather, he waited until the material itself dictated the correct placement. It was less about brute effort and more about coaxing the truth out of the matter. Eventually, the old craftsman paused, turning his gaze upon Pythagoras. His eyes held not judgment or surprise, but a deep, encompassing knowing, the look of one who has witnessed the cyclical nature of things. He picked up two seemingly disparate pieces, one curved, organic, and irregular, the other sharp, straight, and rigidly defined. He did not speak of ratios or theorems immediately. Instead, he placed them near each other on his workbench. Pythagoras instinctively reached for a measuring tool, ready to quantify the gap, the ratio of their differences. But the master gently stopped his hand. The silence that followed was immense, weighted with unutterable meaning. The craftsman finally spoke, and his voice was low, like the resonance of a perfectly struck bell. "You look for the rule in the calculation, young seeker. You seek the final number." He paused, letting Pythagoras digest this cryptic statement. "But do you ever consider where the rule comes from? Who taught the wood to be straight? Who set the angle?" The questions were profound and disarming. They shifted Pythagoras' focus away from the output, the measurable shape, and toward the invisible source of its coherence. He realized his entire pursuit had been fundamentally flawed. He was treating geometry as a divine mandate, when perhaps it was merely an observation of persistent tendencies. "Geometry," the master continued, tapping the smooth piece of curved wood, "is not simply about measurement. It is about resonance, about how disparate forces agree to coexist in balance." He then picked up a small, imperfectly formed sphere and set it next to a perfectly carved cube. "Observe these two things. One defies sharp angles, one demands them. Which is more true?" The lesson was not mathematical at all. It was ontological. The old master taught Pythagoras that absolute knowledge of a single ratio would lead him down an infinite rabbit hole, forgetting the grand totality. True understanding, he suggested, lay in recognizing the inherent tension and harmony between opposing forces. He spoke of balance not as a single zero-sum equation, but as a dynamic interplay, like the relationship between light and shadow, or structure and curve. Both are necessary to define the boundaries of reality itself. To discard one is to lose definition entirely. He wasn't meant to find a single universal number. He was meant to understand the constant negotiation between opposites. The master smiled faintly, completing his cryptic lesson with a gentle gesture that implied an entire philosophy. Pythagoras left the workshop with a profound sense of intellectual disorientation mixed with powerful clarity. His obsession had been too narrow. He had sought the definitive equation for life when existence itself is defined by its beautiful, irreducible lack of definition. The blueprint was not a final mathematical decree. It was an endless dialogue. The celebration hall buzzed with manufactured delight. Laughter echoed off polished stone walls, a sound so vibrant it felt almost physically potent. It was meant to be a testament to communal joy, an ode to human harmony. But for Pythagoras, amid the revelry, there was only overwhelming dissonance. He observed groups swaying, voices rising and falling in predictable, yet unsettlingly artificial patterns. The music that filled the air was not built upon mathematical principles of pure resonance. It was structured around emotional manipulation. Notes climbed too quickly, dropped with sudden, yearning swells, designed solely to elicit a response. A sigh, a clap, a shared sense of melancholy remembrance. He found himself standing apart, an island of quiet contemplation in a sea of uncontrolled feeling. Every chord struck felt like a calculated lever, intended not to reveal truth, but to enforce a collective mood. He watched couples embracing with exaggerated passion, friends laughing at jokes that seemed utterly meaningless if one stripped away the sheer force of emotional performance. It was all noise, yes, but it was organized noise, artfully crafted noise designed to mask an underlying instability. Previously, his obsession had been quantifying the external world. the ratios in shadows, the angles of stone formations, the beats of a perfect chord. Now, he faced a far more subtle and challenging frontier, the mathematics of human emotion itself. He began to analyze the music not as sound waves, but as an emotional equation. A sudden key change wasn't just shifting pitch. It was introducing a variable of nostalgic longing, demanding tears or bittersweet reminiscence. The rhythm accelerated not because the dancers needed more energy, but to simulate the breathless thrill of youth passing too quickly. The intellectual puzzle gave way to a profound sense of alienation. He recognized that these emotional surges were potent, yes, but they lacked inherent mathematical truth. They relied on the collective susceptibility to feeling, a weakness he had previously dismissed in favor of cold, hard calculation. His mind searched desperately for the governing principle of the spectacle. If joy was a variable, what defined its maximum capacity? And grief? Was it simply the absence of that capacity, or did it require a specific ratio of loss to feeling? He felt trapped between two truths. On one hand, there was the undeniable mathematical beauty he sought, the elegant simplicity of cause and effect. On the other, there was this raw, intoxicating mess of human existence, where pleasure followed not from ratios, but from immediate emotional input, often irrational and deeply satisfying. The master craftsman's lesson echoed in his mind. True understanding lies in recognizing inherent balance rather than calculating a final ratio. But how does one measure balance when the inputs are volatile feelings? He noticed a man weeping dramatically near the fountain, yet simultaneously giving an overly enthusiastic toast to a colleague who had merely complimented him on his attire. The emotional output was wildly disproportionate to the minimal input. Pythagoras felt overwhelmed by the scale of it all. His careful scaffolding of numerical law seemed inadequate to contain this torrent of human melodrama. He realized that while nature, in its grand sweeping gestures, the orbit of planets, the growth of a spiral shell, adhered to glorious and immutable equations, human emotional life operated on principles far more fluid, almost stochastic. It was imperfect, dramatically so. The chaos he witnessed was not merely randomness, it was controlled imperfection. The gaiety, the tears, the sudden bursts of laughter, these were all signs that humanity had mastered a form of performance art, a living equation where the goal wasn't stability, but resonance. And to resonate required an acceptance of the non-quantifiable. He took several steps back, physically removing himself from the immediate emotional fray. He needed distance not just to observe, but to reset his internal parameters. His initial philosophical belief had been that truth was found in purification, in stripping away all subjective interference until only clean mathematics remained. But this evening suggested a more complex calculus. The purity of numbers felt brittle when set against the vivid, messy resilience of the human spirit. The great realization struck him not as a geometric proof, but as a quiet depletion of energy. He understood that if he continued to measure every spontaneous expression, every tear and every shouted farewell, by some invisible mathematical rule, he would only become a spectator, unable to participate in the messy, illogical vitality around him. True peace, it became clear, was not attained by finding the perfect equilibrium ratio, the point where opposing forces cancel each other out into elegant zero. Instead, true internal serenity required detachment. Detachment from the expectation of perfection. Detachment from the need to calculate every outcome, emotional or physical. He had been so intent on building a comprehensive equation for existence that he was forgetting the most fundamental variable: acceptance. Acceptance of the discordant, the beautiful, and the fundamentally unpredictable texture of being human. The persistent echo of numbers had become the soundtrack to Pythagoras's life. Every rustle of leaves, every flicker of light, seemed to obey an elegant arithmetic that compelled him to measure it all. After confronting the messy, unpredictable chaos of human emotion and witnessing the mastery of inherent balance, a new stillness began to settle within him. He no longer sought equations in grand cosmic events, but rather in the subtle architecture of his own being, starting with the quiet drama of desire. He retreated into profound meditation, finding himself adrift in the deep pools of introspection. Here, stripped of external distractions and temporal demands, he turned his focus inward. He observed hunger, a primal, undeniable ache that demanded fulfillment. He tracked worry, the phantom discomfort of what might be. These were not abstract concepts to him, but vivid physical experiences, variables demanding quantification. He began charting these internal landscapes as if they were distant celestial bodies on a mathematical chart. The pang of hunger, for instance, arrived with an initial spike in intensity, followed by a gradual dip as the mind distracted itself, only to crest again when the true need resurfaced. He mapped this fluctuation using rhythmic sequences, a rising curve, a plateau, and then a fall. It was a pattern, undeniable and pure, much like the perfect interval of a plucked string. He turned his attention to worry next. The source of anxiety is always nebulous, a hypothetical future failure, a perceived slight, or an uncertain outcome. Yet even this nebulosity held internal logic. He analyzed the moment the worry began, usually triggered by a memory, perhaps tinged with regret over a past choice. This initial trigger served as the seed value in his arithmetic sequence. From there, the anxiety would proliferate, ramping up exponentially, feeding on what-if statements. The worrying mind was merely following an accelerating geometric progression of fear. Pythagoras felt a startling revelation. Emotion itself did not surge arbitrarily. It moved according to a discernible pattern. Grief, he noticed, followed a curved path that began with a sudden shock and deepened into sustained melancholy, the rhythm changing only when external acknowledgement was granted. Desire, in its restless pursuit, showed a predictable diminishing return. The more intensely he chased something, the less satisfying the subsequent effort became, eventually leading to a state of resigned, measured expectation. The equations were there. The internal mechanism governing his wants, fears, and joys followed clear numerical laws. Emotion was not chaos. It was an intricate, self-regulating system of ratios and cycles. This knowledge brought with it both profound comfort and a daunting philosophical expansion. If even the most ephemeral flicker of yearning could be measured by sequence, what did that imply about free will? He realized that merely observing these patterns was not enough. He had to understand their operators. Why did the initial spike of worry always lead back to the root trigger? What mathematical constant governed the rate at which hope faded into cautious anticipation? He began mentally dismantling his emotional reactions, assigning them variable values, and understanding the mechanisms of their transformation. This deep excavation led him past simple pattern recognition and toward a far more complex realization that these patterns were not fixed, inevitable laws governing men, but rather models describing tendencies. The equation was always influenced by an external factor, a shift in focus, a deliberate act of acceptance, or simply the passage of time. These variable coefficients of the internal equations represented choice itself. His contemplation moved beyond merely charting emotions to actively modulating them. If anxiety followed a progression, could that progression be interrupted? Could he intervene at the initial trigger point with enough intellectual precision to derail the exponential growth of worry? This became his new meditation, not simply observing the arithmetic of desire, but practicing the calculus of response. The challenge now was to solidify this knowledge. Understanding these internal cycles needed real-world application, a move from abstract thought to embodied practice. He understood that mere intellectual mastery was insufficient. He had to treat his life, and the emotions within it, as laboratory subjects in a grand experiment of self-governance. The arithmetic of desire promised not the elimination of feeling, but the rigorous structure for managing its tides. It offered a path toward equilibrium, suggesting that true freedom lay not in randomness, but in recognizing and mastering one's own internal numerical laws. He stood at the precipice of complete understanding, poised to test his newly derived formulae against the challenging variables of human experience itself. The whispers of numbers had become the constant rhythm of Pythagoras's life. They were everywhere, in the fall of leaves, in the stretch of a shadow, and deep within the chambers of his own breast. Having spent time mapping the predictable arithmetic of his desires, he now faced the ultimate task, to measure not the fleeting peaks of emotion or the sudden depths of sorrow, but the steady, undeniable rhythm of being itself. His focus shifted from external ratios, the distances between stars or the perfect chords vibrating in a plucked string, to an interior geography. The breath became his primary instrument. It was simple, involuntary, and utterly constant. In it resided a profound mathematical law. Inhalation must follow exhalation, measured by the subtle weight of existence passing through him. He taught himself to count not merely breaths, but moments. Each inhale was not just oxygen drawn into the lungs. It represented an acceptance of what was, a momentary gathering of potential. Each exhale was the conscious release, the relinquishing of tension, worry, or expectation, the letting go of what had been. He began this practice in absolute solitude, drawing himself into a quiet crucible of self-examination. The counting was relentless, yet strangely soothing. It required an attention so deep it stripped away all external distractions. At first, the act felt like mental labor, an attempt to contain the wildness of thought within neat numerical boundaries. He counted 20 cycles, then 30, then 50. With every passing count, a peculiar shift occurred in his internal state. The anxiety that had once coiled tightly around his chest began to slacken, like a bowstring released by its own weight. He was not merely counting air. He was charting the slow, steady pulse of life's enduring mechanism. The goal was to find the underlying law governing this natural rhythm. Was there a perfect ratio between the length and depth of breath? Did tension require an exponential counterforce in release? His mind sought the elegance of formula even here, where none was explicitly required. Yet, as he continued, he began to grasp something more profound than mere ratios. The number itself seemed less important than the quality of the movement between numbers. It was the perfect balance between intake and output. The quiet understanding that each full breath represented a cyclical return to equilibrium. This observation formed the foundational core of his philosophy. That sustained calm was not an achievement, nor was it earned through complex calculation or sudden revelation. True being, he realized, resonated with this steady ebb and flow. It demanded acceptance in both states, the gathering force of breath in and the yielding surrender of breath out. If life's challenges were difficult ratios that defied easy summation, then the practice of counting breath provided a constant anchor to reality. The struggle to find the formula had given way to the recognition of natural process. The counting transformed his relationship with time itself. Time was no longer a linear accumulation of events to be recorded or analyzed for cause and effect. It became the continuous interval between breaths, a series of contained, balanced moments. Each second held the potential for perfect harmony if one ceased trying to solve it fully and simply observed its steady passing. The mastery attained here was profoundly subtle. It was not about willpower overpowering circumstance. It was about acknowledging that the strongest resistance came from trying too hard to control the uncontrollable. By observing his breath, he learned where control began and surrendered. He found strength not in stopping the cycle, but in aligning himself perfectly with its inevitable rhythm. This self-mastery became a blueprint for how he wished all things, be they relationships, political systems, or even profound natural disasters, to operate. This understanding of breath carried him outward. It suggested that if man's inner life could be regulated by the primal rhythm of air, then perhaps society and art could also be calmed by attending to their basic cycles. The disciplined focus required for counting his own existence prepared him for larger observations. He began to see this steady, measured beat as the silent, underlying law governing all harmonious systems, a geometry built not of perfect lines, but of cyclical breathing. The weight of profound calm settled upon him. It was a stillness that was never empty, always resonant with potential and rhythm. This new baseline established by self-regulation allowed his philosophical journey to deepen dramatically. He moved past the pure arithmetic of observation and entered the realm of lived embodiment. He understood now that knowledge was incomplete unless it could regulate the physical self. He knew that this core practice, the mindful regulation of respiration, was more valuable than any chord struck or equation derived. It was the fundamental act of being present. The rhythmic count became a mantra, an anchor against the inevitable storms of external chaos and internal doubt. Pythagoras realized that by mastering the interval between one breath and the next, he had finally mastered the steady cadence of his own enduring being. This simple rhythm offered him a profound peace, preparing him to confront the messy, beautiful truth of existence without the desperate need for every aspect of life to conform to a neat, perfect integer. The rhythmic certainty of his breath had become an anchor. It was a measured cycle, a perfect miniature of existence itself. Yet, the steady counting could not contain him forever. A restless curiosity, spurred by the undeniable patterns etched into every corner of life, pulled him onward. His journey led him far from the structured rhythm of self-discipline and toward the raw grandeur of the open land. He found himself approaching a place that seemed to breathe antiquity, a circle built of monumental stones, silent witnesses to forgotten epochs, a megalithic site. The weight of these massive, carefully placed rocks suggested not just labor, but inherent order. They stood in stark contrast to the chaos he had observed earlier, the unpredictable swirl of human passion and fleeting whim. Here, everything felt deliberate, governed by an unseen principle that predated man's understanding of cause and effect. He walked among them for hours. His mind, trained by years of counting internal rhythms and external ratios, began to analyze the arrangement. He didn't seek mere straight lines or simple counts. He sought the deep, underlying geometry that dictated placement and proportion. It was here, amid the whispers of the stones, that his focus narrowed, pulling away from human experience and toward the immutable language of nature itself. As he traced the arcs and alignments, a specific form began to catch his eye. Not sharp angles, but graceful curves. He saw natural rock formations whose edges did not conclude abruptly, but spiraled outward in slow, magnificent progressions. They spoke of growth, of continuous expansion governed by a divine measure. His breath hitched. This was no mere coincidence. This was the signature of profound mathematics embedded within the very fabric of stone. The theory had always suggested that ratios dictated reality. He knew the golden mean, the proportion found in ideal beauty, in art, and theoretically in biology. But to see it enacted so visibly, so monumentally, by unthinking nature, it was overwhelming. The stones seemed to hum with a silent equation. Every spiral, every curve of accretion, appeared to follow that perfect ratio he had studied abstractly. He realized these patterns were universal. They were not confined to the delicate perfection of music or the predictable cycle of breath. They governed the massive, slow workings of geology itself. The earth, it seemed, was a gigantic equation expressed in solid rock. The cosmos, from the tiniest spiral shell to the grand curve of the stone circle, whispered an elegant mathematical truth. All is ordered, all proceeds by ratio. This discovery, however profound, did not bring him simple, unadulterated peace. It brought a deeper, more complex realization, a philosophical gravity that challenged everything he thought he understood about life's complexity. The inherent order was undeniable, yet it felt complete, too perfect to be purely deterministic. If every curve and every growth followed such beautiful, immutable laws, where did the space for genuine choice reside? Was man simply a biological accident unfolding according to pre-written geometric principles? The whispers of the stones suggested an answer, but that answer was incomplete. He understood that while ratios governed the matter, the stones themselves, the way water flowed over them, they could not account for the fleeting, unpredictable spark that made life truly vital. He spent the remainder of his time at the circle in contemplation, allowing the sheer weight of cosmic math to press upon his understanding. He knew he had found a monumental truth. The mathematical backbone of existence was breathtakingly beautiful. Yet, as dusk settled and cast long, stark shadows across the polished faces of the megaliths, he felt the familiar, persistent itch of doubt return. The equation held true for rock and spiral, but would it hold true for a tear of joy? Or the sudden leap of unreasoning faith? This single stone circle had unveiled a grand cosmic harmony, only to deepen his original dilemma, forcing him to confront the boundary between pattern and pure being. After the celestial spirals of the stone circle convinced him of cosmic order, Pythagoras faced a new paradox. He had witnessed undeniable mathematical perfection in nature, from the perfect curve of a shell to the precise sweep of ancient masonry. The cosmos was, it seemed, a masterpiece built upon elegant, predictable equations. But these equations worked flawlessly on rock and plant life. They faltered completely when confronted by the unpredictable geometry of the human heart. The pattern held fast in the external world, yet within himself, things were messy. If existence followed such strict mathematical laws, where then did pain, joy, and inexplicable grief fit into the ratio? Was sorrow merely a variable to be accounted for? He tried to apply the perfect logic he had spent years accumulating, the golden ratio, the divine proportion of harmony, to the recent distress caused by those he loved. The conflict was immediate, visceral, and deeply unsettling. A casual word, an overlooked gesture, a moment of deep misunderstanding from a friend or family member struck him with unanticipated force. It was not the magnitude of the event that wounded him, but its sheer defiance of pattern. Pain did not follow a neat curve. It arrived suddenly, sharply, breaking all known expectations. He instinctively reached for his tools of understanding: ratios, sequences, geometric theorems. He began to measure the damage, attempting to quantify the emotional blow in terms of loss or deviation. If pain was merely a calculation, he believed, then its solution must also be calculable. Perhaps grief represented a negative variable, and healing simply required adding an opposite positive force. The first attempts were clumsy. He tracked patterns of disappointment, trying to isolate the cause-effect chain in the interaction that led to his hurt. But the equation kept breaking down. The emotions refused to align into neat variables on his internal ledger. Grief was not a steady decay. It was jagged, unpredictable, and surged without warning. Doubt was not merely an angle of deflection. It was an entire collapsing dimension. He spent days observing this emotional geometry failure. He realized that while he understood the mathematics of planetary orbits or crystal growth, these laws offered no predictive model for a heart betrayed by perceived indifference. The numbers simply ceased to speak the language of human connection. It was profoundly destabilizing. His entire life's work had been dedicated to finding the universal constant, the single ratio that explained all things. Now he faced an enormous void. Emotional reality appeared fundamentally nonlinear, stubbornly resisting every equation. This failure forced a fundamental crisis deeper than mere intellectual puzzle solving. It challenged his very premise of knowledge. Was his understanding merely a beautiful approximation of the truth? If love and hurt operated outside the rules of geometry, did that mean they were exempt from the laws governing the physical world? The contemplation was exhausting, leaving him oscillating between the comforting solidity of numbers and the turbulent depths of unquantifiable feeling. He stood at a precipice, staring into the gap where perfect logic met messy, irreducible humanity. He realized that his pursuit had been one of external universal order, but true knowledge might reside in mastering this internal, unpredictable geometry all the same. Pythagoras carried the weight of profound contradiction. Up to this point, his philosophy had been a grand tapestry woven from numbers, a belief that existence was nothing more than an elegant calculation. He saw ratios in the turning moon, the spiraling shell, and the fall of every leaf. The cosmos, it seemed, operated on immutable mathematical laws, perfect geometry governing all things. But the recent experiences had chipped away at this certainty, leaving him standing before a fundamental dilemma. Mathematics explained the arrangement of the stars. Geometry could predict the curve of the river. Yet, emotions, the unpredictable rush of grief, the sharp sting of unexpected joy, the weight of a discarded memory, these defy any simple ratio. They are messy, non-linear variables that refuse to be contained within an equation. The wound left by his loved one remained raw, a constant reminder that love and loss do not adhere to the neat predictability of calculus. He had attempted once, in desperate moments, to assign a quantifiable value to sorrow, treating grief as merely a negative coefficient. It was like trying to balance an emotional scale using only physical weights. The true measure always slipped through his fingers. He found himself isolated, retreating into a quiet contemplation that felt almost punitive. He sought wisdom not from the patterns of nature, but from the steady, unblinking gaze of those who had mastered internal lives, men who lived by principles more enduring than physical laws. The path to understanding led him unexpectedly toward the precepts of non-attachment. It was a concept foreign to his purely numerical framework. How could one assign a number to not caring? How could he map indifference, or rather, freedom from emotional dependency, onto a sensible arithmetic sequence. He began observing these principles not as abstract thought experiments, but as practical equations for the soul. He realized that attachment itself was simply a complex form of ratio, an over-indexing on another person's existence relative to one's own sense of self-worth. The belief that happiness hinges upon the continued presence of another is a numerical imbalance. It introduces unnecessary volatility into the carefully calculated stability of one's inner life. The core realization struck him with the force of undeniable clarity, not through studying stellar alignments, but through rigorous internal geometry. Attachment creates stress because it makes your peace conditional. It forces you to treat self-worth as a variable dependent on external confirmation. This dependence is mathematically unstable. When the source fluctuates, when the other person changes, moves away, or simply fails to meet expectation, your own emotional equilibrium crashes. He began to develop a mental model for detachment, viewing it as establishing a zero ratio of necessary dependency. If the metric connecting your internal state to an external event is set to nothing, then no amount of external turmoil can destabilize you. This 0 point represented not emptiness, but absolute self-containment. He started practicing this in small, systematic ways. When worry flared over a future outcome, a fear that had absolutely no immediate presence, he would pause and mathematically dissect it. He separated the prediction, the assumed negative ratio, from the reality, the current moment. The gap between them represented zero need for urgent action, thus equating to zero internal stress. The pattern became, if worry is simply a disproportionate attribution of negative probability, then negating that attribution sets the mental equation back to balance. The philosophy taught him that freedom was an arithmetic process. Freedom was realizing that your ability to find peace is not contingent on perfect external harmony, but solely on the ratio you assign to external events in relation to your core self. When you accept this 0 point calculation, the understanding that nothing outside of yourself has the power to define your internal state, you achieve a profound state of non-attachment. This was radically different from his early quest for harmonious ratios. Before, he sought harmony by finding cosmic patterns. Now, he found it through subtraction. He was no longer trying to balance physical forces or musical chords. He was balancing the relationship between his mind and its objects of focus. The mastery of non-attachment proved that the most powerful equations are not those governing matter, but those governing consciousness itself. It granted him a new lens through which to view the world, a steady calculus of self-sufficiency. The knowledge did not just reduce anxiety, it fundamentally restructured his internal architecture, making him immune to the corrosive mathematics of fear and neediness. His journey had shifted from asking how the universe was constructed to understanding how he could successfully inhabit it without being destroyed by its unpredictable beauty or its inevitable hardships. He understood that while life's outer surface might remain a baffling mix of chaos and perfect pattern, his inner core could be maintained as an ordered space, anchored by the unwavering truth of non-reliance. He returned to the plaza where his journey had begun. It was a space defined by vibrant chaos, a place where people lived and where meaning clashed with mere existence. Before, he would have analyzed the noise, counting the irregular patterns of human interaction, trying to assign ratios to joy or geometric figures to grief. He searched for the perfect equation that explained why laughter peaked at certain sounds or why sorrow descended in predictable arcs. But now, nothing eluded him, and yet everything defied calculation. The dissonances were still there, more profound than before. The symphony of life was anything but mathematically pristine. Yet he carried within him a knowledge far stranger than any numerical law. He had learned to measure things not with rods or ratios, but with awareness itself. This acceptance, this mastery over his own inner calculus, changed everything about what he heard. The original dissonance that had first drawn him into philosophy was no longer a problem to be solved. It became simply the background music of being. It resonated, yes, but it did not dictate. He realized that the deepest order was not found in the cosmic perfection of spirals etched on ancient stones, nor in the crystalline structure of perfect chords. The true law lay within the delicate rhythm of breath, the steady 0 point established between needing and receiving. This understanding transformed his listening. He began to hear a harmony, yes, but it was not an echo of pure mathematical truth. It was something richer, imperfectly tuned, yet deeply resonant. It was the sound of acceptance itself. He watched people passing by, a merchant haggling loudly, children chasing stray dogs, an elderly woman weeping quietly on a bench. Each scene, once screaming defiance to his orderly world, now flowed with a kind of undeniable logic that had nothing to do with numbers at all. The child's laughter was random, the argument sharp and erratic, but they existed within the grand cycle of becoming and passing away. Pythagoras understood that seeking an equation for human life was like trying to borrow wind. It was impossible. Such emotions were not variables in a fixed system. They were energies, forces flowing through the current of moments. To try to calculate them was merely to observe them from a distance, reducing their vibrant reality to cold data points. He remembered the struggle with the loved one, the emotional damage that defied any clean geometric measure. Grief had no formula. Joy required no measurable input. These truths were non-linear and profound precisely because they resisted classification. The internal work, the meditation on desire, the centering upon the breath, and especially the rigorous practice of non-attachment, had not taught him how to predict emotions or calculate happiness. Instead, it taught him where true power resided, in the moment of choosing his response. He no longer sought the perfect ratio between cause and effect. He sought the 0 point within himself, the quiet space that remained when he surrendered the need for certainty. This internal sanctuary allowed him to receive reality as it was, messy, loud, flawed, beautiful, without the intellectual anguish of correction. It was not about becoming a mathematical observer of man. It was about becoming an integrated part of the flow. He realized acceptance is not passive surrender. It is an active choice, a conscious decision to acknowledge the rhythm without needing to master or alter it. It is understanding that the imperfection itself contains the potential for the most profound beauty. The symphony he heard now was a vast, complex chord composed of contradiction. The mathematical order of gravity pulling at the earth, juxtaposed against the spontaneous, unquantifiable leap of human spirit. He saw the cosmic mechanism working with elegant precision, yes, but nestled within that structure were moments entirely unique to man. A shared glance, an unplanned conversation, a sudden burst of unexpected empathy. These small acts possessed no predictable ratios. Their value was intrinsic and immediate. This journey had stripped away his need for all things to resolve neatly into integers. He embraced the inherent wildness. The flaw in the system was not the human heart, but man's relentless desire to fix it with an equation. By accepting the variables, the unpredictable sorrow, the unmeasurable depth of care, he finally found peace. It was a state far surpassing mere contemplation. It was harmony achieved through radical internal agreement. He walked away from that plaza carrying not a theorem, but a profound quietude. The mathematical quest had prepared him for this final, intuitive wisdom, that to understand life fully, one must stop counting it and start simply inhabiting it. He began walking into the complexity, no longer an anxious calculator of universal laws, but a steady participant in existence itself. His journey was complete not with discovery, but with quiet arrival. Pythagoras stood at the confluence of all his studies. His journey had spanned perfect chords, chaotic celebrations, and the silent mathematics etched into ancient stone. He had begun by seeking absolute mathematical proof for existence, a pure ratio that could explain everything from the flight of a bird to the depth of human grief. In the beginning, reality seemed a flawless equation waiting only for him to solve it, but what he found was far more intricate than any neat formula. After confronting the non-linear pain of loss and achieving radical self-reliance through the zero ratio of non-attachment, his perspective had undergone a fundamental shift. He no longer approached life as a grand problem to be solved, but as a continuous process to be experienced. The ultimate realization was this: existence is not built solely upon rigid, perfect equations. Those numbers are merely the scaffolding, beautiful and necessary, but ultimately insufficient to describe the full truth of being. There are pattern recognition in life, yes, but they are patterns defined by cyclical momentum and conscious choice, not by fixed numerical inevitability. The steady rhythm he found while counting his breath became the keystone to understanding all patterns. It was a balance, an inhale giving way to an exhale, neither dominating the other, simply existing together in resonant equality. This simple cycle demonstrated that stability does not come from reaching a perfect mathematical peak, but from maintaining balanced movement through opposition. The wisdom accumulated over years taught him that every apparent chaos harbors an underlying rhythm. Human emotion, for all its unpredictable fury, the sudden joy, the crushing sorrow, is itself bound by cycles. Grief crests and ebbs, anger flares and subsides. These are patterns of emotional inertia, predictable in their recurring nature even if their magnitude is unique each time. He understood that the mind, at its heart, is a magnificent pattern-seeking machine. We crave coherence above all else, seeking to fit the messy sprawl of experience into the comforting grid lines of if and then. This impulse for classification is deeply human, a protective mechanism against overwhelming randomness. This desire to categorize and predict is inherently valuable, providing us with the tools for science and engineering. It allows us to build bridges that will stand or write theories that explain distant stars. But when prediction becomes the sole measure of reality, we risk losing sight of something more essential: presence. To recognize a pattern is merely to observe the visible thread connecting 2 points in time. But understanding the pattern requires accepting the space between them, the unknown variation, the unquantifiable here and now that cannot be neatly averaged into a mean. This void is where genuine freedom resides. He learned that self-mastery was not achieved by discovering an ultimate cosmic constant, but through establishing internal consistency. It meant choosing one's response to life's inevitable disruptions. When pain struck, he did not calculate the geometry of its wound. Instead, he acknowledged its existence, allowing himself to feel the full non-linear reality of sorrow without letting it define his core self. The initial desire to measure everything eventually matured into a powerful form of deep acceptance, an acceptance that embraces magnificent imperfection. Life is therefore not an equation whose variables must be perfectly balanced to yield zero stress. Rather, it is a dynamic composition where tension and release, harmony and discord, exist simultaneously. It becomes less about finding the hidden code governing existence and more about learning how to inhabit the inherent flow of that code. Recognizing pattern does not mean predetermining outcomes. It means understanding the tendencies, the gravitational pull towards certain results, if nothing else. This knowledge provides immense power, a gentle foresight that allows one to navigate life with steadiness and resilience. This final wisdom was his greatest gift. He accepted that while the universe operates on beautiful, underlying mathematical laws, ratios governing matter, cycles governing time, the space where human consciousness intersects with that law is governed by choice. We are not merely reflections of natural order. We are active participants capable of introducing novel variables into the equation of our own lives. And this capacity for free will, unpredictable